Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, February 28th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, 67% of U.S. voters favor permanent Gaza ceasefire. So a new poll from Data for Progress has found that about two-thirds of American voters support the idea of the U.S. pushing for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an idea that is opposed by the Biden administration. So when asked if they support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire and a general de-escalation of violence, 67% of respondents said that they did, and that includes 77% of Democrats, 69% of independents, and 56% of Republicans. That means the majority of Republicans are saying the U.S. should call for a permanent ceasefire. And the support for a permanent ceasefire increased by 6 points since Data for Progress conducted the same poll, asked the same question. That was conducted at the end of November. So the support for a ceasefire is increasing. And throughout this conflict, throughout the Israeli massacre of Palestinians in Gaza, since the very beginning, since right after October 7th, the polling has consistently shown that the majority of Americans favor a ceasefire, and that support for that position is growing. So in the latest poll, voters were then asked if they would support the U.S. calling for a ceasefire, de-escalation, and the release of Israeli hostages from Gaza. So that's the language that was added to the second question, is that would they support ceasefire, de-escalation, and the release of Israeli hostages? And that increased support for the idea by 74%. And then there was another question. Apparently, they presented them with arguments from both sides on why or why not to support a permanent ceasefire right now. 50% said that the U.S. should call for a ceasefire right now, while 35% said it should happen after Hamas is defeated. And 15% said that they weren't sure. So where things stand now with we have a story on the hostage negotiations next, but Hamas has been, their offer has been the release of all the Israeli hostages for a permanent ceasefire. That's basically been what they've been after now for a few months. They also want the release of a lot of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli prisons. They've asked for about 1,500 in their last proposal. That was for a 135-day ceasefire. But the Biden administration is pushing for this deal that's a 6-week ceasefire, and Netanyahu has made it very clear that that's a temporary ceasefire, that after the 6 weeks, he would restart everything if they reach a deal, and that would include Israel invading Rafah. So as things stand now, the latest numbers put the death toll in Gaza around 30,000 Palestinians killed since October 7th, and over 69,000 wounded. And those casualties, about two-thirds of them are women and children. All right, so to get into the next story here, Israel and Hamas say that Biden spoke too soon about potential hostage deal. So President Biden said on Monday that a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas was close and that he hoped a ceasefire could be reached by Monday, March 4th. But in response, both sides indicated that an agreement is still far away and said the president spoke too soon. So according to the Times of Israel, one Hamas official said that Biden's comments were premature and didn't reflect reality. Another Hamas official told Reuters that there was still big gaps between the two sides, and that's because Hamas is still saying that they're looking for a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli troops. A second Hamas official said, speaking to Reuters, said, quote, "The primary and main issues of the ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces are not clearly stated, which delays reaching an agreement," end quote. So Biden's comments came as a surprise to Israeli officials, and reports said that Netanyahu himself was surprised in that these comments were not made in coordination with the Israeli government. Israeli officials are blaming the lack of an agreement on Hamas's demands, although they're also saying that Netanyahu is complicating the negotiations by adding demands himself. There was a report from Haaretz on Monday that said he was saying the Palestinian prisoners who are being released should be deported to Turkey or Qatar or another third country. And again, I just mentioned that Netanyahu is making very clear any ceasefire is temporary. So nothing too hopeful yet on these hostage deal talks. We keep seeing Israeli and Hamas officials, both sides, downplaying the idea that a deal is going to be reached anytime soon. All right, so the next one here, Hezbollah would halt fire on Israel if a ceasefire is reached in Gaza. So Reuters reported on Tuesday that Hezbollah would halt fire on Israel if Hamas agrees to a hostage deal that includes a ceasefire unless Israel continues to bomb southern Lebanon. So during the previous hostage deal that resulted in a 7-day truce in Gaza, there was calm across the Lebanon-Israel border. But in recent months, the situation has been escalating and Israel has been hitting targets deeper inside Lebanon. So a source close to Hezbollah said, quote, "The moment Hamas announces its approval of the truce and the moment the truce is declared, Hezbollah will adhere to the truce and will stop operations in the south immediately as happened the previous time," end quote. Israel has sent the opposite message, with Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant threatening an escalation of strikes if a hostage deal is reached. Gallant said over the weekend, quote, "In the event of a temporary truce in Gaza, we will increase the fire in the north independently and will continue until the full withdrawal of Hezbollah and the return of the residents to their homes," end quote. So France has been trying to mediate a deal between Hezbollah and Israel and submitted a written proposal that would involve Hezbollah withdrawing 6 miles from the Israeli border. But Hezbollah has said it would only enter talks once there was a ceasefire in Gaza. So you have Hezbollah saying that they'll talk once there's a ceasefire, and then you have Israel threatening to escalate things if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. And I think this goes to show that Israel is not seeking de-escalation here. So according to a count from AFP, Israeli strikes on Lebanon have killed 284 people, including 44 civilians, and the Israeli military has said that Hezbollah's attacks on Israel have killed 10 Israeli soldiers and 6 civilians. So pretty significant casualties there, much higher on the Lebanon side. 284 people, and this continues. They're still trading strikes across the border. All right, so the next one here, Egypt threatens the group that reported on the Sinai camps. So Egypt has been accused of threatening a human rights group that first reported on the construction of a walled camp for Palestinian refugees in the Sinai Desert on the border with Gaza. So 18 civil society groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, said that Egyptian officials have been engaged in a smear campaign against the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights and its director, Ahmed Salam. So this group was the first to report on the construction of the walled camp and said it was being built to prepare for an influx of Palestinian refugees as Israel is threatening to invade Rafah, which borders Egypt. And it's packed with 1.5 million Palestinians. It'll be a total bloodbath if they do this. And Egypt is worried about some of those 1.5 million Palestinians making it across the border. So Egypt has denied the report, but the Wall Street Journal also published a story on the construction and cited unnamed Egyptian officials who said the camp would be able to house 100,000 Palestinians, but that Cairo would like to keep the number between 50,000 and 60,000. So according to this statement put out by these civil society groups or human rights groups, whatever you want to call them, since mid-February, Egyptian government officials and pro-government figures have engaged in an aggressive smear campaign against the Sinai Foundation and Salam on television, in newspapers, and social media. The statement also alleges that Salam, who is based in the UK, has been threatened that he would be brought back to Egypt if he didn't stop what he was doing, and was warned that he was not far from reach even abroad. Salem has said that in order to prevent the news of the construction being made public, the Egyptian military increased patrols and checkpoints in the area, stopped residents and construction workers, and is looking into the contents of their mobile phones in an attempt to intimidate locals and prevent reporting about the construction work of the fortified zone. And again, this is right on the border of Gaza that they're building this big walled enclosure. So we know Israeli government officials have not been shy about their desire to expel Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And a document prepared by Israel's intelligence ministry that was leaked back in October said the best case scenario for Israel would be to send all 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza into Egypt. So far, Cairo has strongly resisted the plan, but this report indicates that Egypt might cave to Israeli pressure to allow at least some Palestinian refugees in if Rafah is invaded. So it seems like Egypt is not happy that this news has gotten out. And I've seen that they're still telling Israel, publicly at least, that, no, we're not letting any Palestinian refugees in, because they know once they come out, Israel's not going to let them back in. I think that's very obvious that would be the case. All right, so the next one here, Biden memo was to avert oversight of support for Israel. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it says that the Biden administration is requiring all countries that receive U.S. military aid, including Israel, to pledge that they will not commit war crimes. The White House crafted the pledge to prevent Congress from placing provisions in the massive military funding bill that would have sought to prevent arms transfers to countries committing crimes with American weapons. Over the past 4 months, American-made weapons have obviously been used by Israeli forces to commit war crimes in Gaza. Earlier this month, President Biden issued this memorandum that said American military aid would be linked to compliance with international law, and the executive order was redundant as the Leahy laws prevent U.S. arms transfers to countries that commit war crimes, that violate human rights, however they put it. And so American presidents have ignored routine violations of humanitarian law while transferring, all these weapons to Israel. So it's easy for American presidents to ignore and bypass these laws. You just look at U.S. military weapons transfers to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE. The list goes on. But the purpose of this memo that was recently issued, as Kyle explains here, was basically to prevent some Democrats were trying to include amendments in the $95 billion military aid bill that still hasn't been passed by the House, but they were trying to include amendments to increase oversight of specifically U.S. aid to Israel, or maybe it was actually more broad. Maybe it didn't specifically target Israel, but they're trying to include more oversight. So this is an effort to placate these Democrats, and it's not going to mean anything because the U.S. is always claiming Israel is not violating international law. And this is something that was explained by Senator Chris Van Hollen. He said, quote, "Myself and the co-sponsors of the amendment made it clear to Majority Leader Schumer that we are determined to have a vote if we don't succeed in implementing it through executive action. That and the fact that it made sense on the merit of it persuaded the administration that they should work with us on this," end quote. So it looks like this is kind of just something that the White House is doing to say that they're doing something, getting assurances from Israel. It's basically going to be a letter that says, I will not commit war crimes or human rights violations with the weapons that you send me. Israel will sign it, and they'll just keep doing what they're doing. And it also does say that there's a pledge for them not to disrupt the delivery of U.S. aid, but that's another thing that's already outlined by foreign assistance laws, and that's that if a country is preventing the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance, that the U.S. shouldn't give them weapons, but that's not stopping anything. All right, so the next one here, a U.S. official admits that only 85 aid trucks are entering Gaza per day. So this is another one from Kyle. And it says that the head of USAID said on Monday that only around 85 aid trucks were able to enter Gaza each day, around 15% of the pre-war number. The White House has touted that it has leveraged U.S. influence to get Israel to provide more aid to the Strip. However, Israel is deploying a myriad of tactics to strangle aid shipments in Gaza. So this is Samantha Power. She posted on X, quote, more than 500 trucks should be entering Gaza daily. In the past week, only 85 per day managed to get through, end quote. And Kyle mentions that Power considers herself an expert on genocide prevention, but she has not called for a ceasefire or an end to U.S. weapon shipments to Israel, even as the International Court of Justice concluded that Tel Aviv was plausibly waging a genocide in Gaza. So if you know anything about Samantha Power, she is, one of these humanitarian interventionists, and she played a major role in the Obama administration's decision to intervene in Libya in 2011. So she's responsible for that debacle. But she considers herself, she's some, when she was appointed this position, there was all these puff pieces about her saying how much she hates genocide. And, I think she might have written a book on it. And here she is, still part of this administration that is supporting this slaughter of civilians in Gaza. So again, we've seen, and this is something Kyle's been kind of focusing on, that U.S. officials acknowledging, Israel is preventing more aid trucks, arbitrary reasons to prevent aid trucks from coming in. They're making it difficult by targeting the police in Gaza who have to escort the aid trucks and all things like that. All right, so the next one here, 2 babies die of malnutrition in northern Gaza amid the Israeli siege. And this is an article from Anadolu, which is the Turkish news agency. And it says that 2 babies died of malnutrition in the northern Gaza Strip amid an Israeli blockade, the health ministry in the enclave said on Tuesday. The infants lost their lives at Kamal Adwan Hospital in the city of Beit Lahia, the ministry added in a statement. The ministry said, quote, dehydration and malnutrition threatens the lives of thousands of children and pregnant women in the Gaza Strip, end quote. And so the ministry appealed to international institutions to conduct a thorough medical assessment in shelter cities to identify and treat people affected by drought and malnutrition to avert a catastrophe. So the reason I wanted to put this up is because we are seeing story here, story there about a child, or in this case, infants starving to death. And I believe I saw one the other day about an old woman who starved to death. And these are going to start adding up, and this might start to happen much more frequently at a much more rapid pace as this thing continues, because, as the conditions are just getting worse and worse for the people on the ground, the most vulnerable, the children, the elderly, the sick, are going to start dying, on a pretty big scale, if things really don't significantly change on the ground. And I know I've seen some famine experts say that even if there's a ceasefire, if the military operations end, they're going to need like a huge humanitarian relief effort, or there's going to be a lot of excess mortalities. All right, so the next one here, NATO chief says no plans for combat troops in Ukraine. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Tuesday that the alliance has no plans to send combat troops to Ukraine after French President Emmanuel Macron stirred an uproar by saying that the idea of deploying troops should not be ruled out. So Stoltenberg told the Associated Press, quote, NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine. We have done that since 2014 and stepped up after the full-scale invasion, but there are no plans for combat troops on the ground in Ukraine, end quote. So in response to Macron's comments, the Kremlin said that a deployment of Western troops to Ukraine would make a direct Russia-NATO war inevitable. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, in this case, we need to talk not about probability, but about the inevitability of conflict, end quote. And of course, that's the case. If NATO deployed troops more than there are special operations forces inside Ukraine. That's something that was revealed by the Discord leaks last year. At the time of the Pentagon document, which was dated March 2023, there was 97 NATO special operations soldiers, including 14 Americans. 50 of them, there's 50 British special forces in there at the time. So we don't know what that number is now. I doubt that they pulled them all out. I'm sure that they're still there at some capacity. But that's a very small number. They're probably training. Some of it could be embassy security, but then again, who knows? They could be what they could be up to in the country. But what they're talking about here more is open big deployments into Ukraine. And so that was Russia's comment, was this would mean war. This would mean direct war, and that means likely nuclear war. How quickly would a direct war between Russia and NATO turn into nuclear war? That's something we don't want to find out. Then Ukraine's response, they were celebrating this talk of NATO sending troops to Ukraine. This is Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak. He said, quote, "This shows, firstly, an absolute awareness of the risks posed to Europe by a militaristic, aggressive Russia," end quote. So some NATO leaders, after Macron's comments, they kind of distanced themselves from the idea of sending combat troops to Ukraine. Poland, Germany, there's a few other countries, I believe the Czech Republic, and the U.S. all came out and said, we don't plan on sending troops. And again, they're talking about, I guess, combat troops or, large numbers of troops for training, because people probably forget that there was confirmation that there is NATO special operations forces on the ground, even though less than 100, still, that's a potential tripwire for war. Who knows what, there's just always that risk of escalation here. But Macron, he's become very much more hawkish than he was in kind of the early days of the Russian invasion. He was one of the ones for a while saying, we need diplomacy and we need to eventually work out a deal with Russia. But now, past year or so, it seems like he's just really gotten on board with everything. All right, so the next one here, Yellen wants frozen Russian bank funds to be given to Ukraine. So Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Tuesday called for the U.S. and its allies to hand $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds to Ukraine, and this would mark a big escalation in the Western economic war against Russia. So Yellen said, quote, "It is necessary and urgent for our coalition to find a way to unlock the value of these immobilized assets to support Ukraine's continued resistance and long-term reconstruction," end quote. And she said this in Brazil, where there's a G20 finance ministers meeting this week. That means Russian officials will probably be there. So this comment from Yellen, this really marks her most supportive statement of this plan, which would be outright theft of Russian funds to finance the war in Ukraine. And this call comes as the Biden administration is struggling to get Congress to pass the $60 billion that it is seeking to fuel the conflict. Yellen added, quote, "I believe there is a strong international law, economic, and moral case for moving forward. This would be a decisive response to Russia's unprecedented threat to global stability," end quote. So the U.S. needs the support of European countries for the plan, as the bulk of the Russian funds, about $200 billion, are held by European banks. The EU is still debating the idea, but they have approved a law to set aside profits made by the Russian central bank funds to potentially send to Ukraine. So they're talking about the money that the Russian funds is making. They're saying that could be potentially used to give Ukraine. And about $67 billion of the Russian money is being held by the U.S. Federal Reserve. U.S. officials have previously expressed concern that spending the Russian funds could make other countries hesitant to keep funds in dollars and thus speed up global de-dollarization. Yellen insisted that it was extremely unlikely that stealing the Russian funds would hurt the dollar or the currency of U.S. allies. She said, quote, "Realistically, there are not alternatives alternatives to the dollar, euro, and yen, end quote. So Japan holds a good amount of the money as well. So the White House has come out in support of the plan and says that it needs legislative authorities from Congress to spend the funds, and legislation has been introduced in both chambers of Congress to create a fund for Ukraine using the Russian money, and the bills have strong bipartisan support. And I know I've seen House Speaker Johnson say that he favors this idea of taking this Russian money to fund the war. All right, so the last story here, the Senate grills U.S. officials over the new Yemen war. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it says that the Biden administration came under fire from lawmakers on Tuesday over the lack of congressional approval to conduct military strikes against Yemen's Houthis and defend foreign ships in the Red Sea. Chris Murphy, who's a senator from Connecticut, he's a Democrat, he said, quote, "There is no existing law that would permit military action against the Houthis. For the military campaign to continue, I believe that a tailored, time-bound congressional authorization isn't just nice to have, it is required," end quote. And he was talking about introducing an authorization, so instead of just opposing this thing, he's saying, well, maybe we should give you the authorization here. So according to this story, the U.S. and the U.K. have hit over 230 Houthi targets in Yemen, and they've, it goes to show how much they have been bombing the country. And I saw Tim Kaine, who is the senator from Virginia, Democrat. He was grilling one of the U.S. officials at this hearing about this idea that, because this started in defense of foreign ships. The Houthis started attacking British and American commercial ships after the U.S. and the U.K. started this bombing campaign. So Kaine basically said, there's no argument here because they're calling it self-defense. Whenever they put out these press releases, they call them self-defense strikes. And Kaine was basically saying that there's no possible argument that defending foreign commercial shipping is self-defense. So, because when they say it's self-defense, that means they're trying to cite Article 2 of the Constitution. So, he's just saying that that's completely ridiculous on the face of it. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's enough opposition in Congress to pass some sort of war powers resolution to stop this thing, but I think it's good at least that some senators are calling this out. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Mark Episkopis, CIA and Ukraine. Is this not a provocation? One from Ashraf Nubani, desperate for peace from Libya to Gaza. One from Max Blumenthal, Israeli claim of systematic rape by Hamas relies on debunked reports. One from Ryo Takuchi, Japan-Russia relationship is U.S.-Russia relationship. And one from Ted Snyder, what really happened in Avdiivka. So please go check all of that out. Follow us on Instagram. Things are really looking good over there. Lots of great posts every day now. Follow us on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. Support this show by sharing it, liking, subscribing. Tell your friends about us at antiwar.com and what we're doing over here. But that's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.